The ashes of the plain rippled beneath the horses' hooves, dispersing the morning mist over the southern hillsides. Somewhere in the distance a coyote cried out, its voice echoing through the rocky beds of dried-up streams. It was late September of 1858, and the air over the Great Plains was growing drier, harsher, like the breath of winter stealing in from the north. The Cheyenne camp, spread out by the Arkansas River, was preparing for the crossing. The tribe did not stay in one place for long. The spirits demanded movement, and the trackers noticed the traces of strangers more and more often. Mahevane, which meant song of the wind, was kneeling by the water, washing the ashes of the ritual fire from her palms. Her face was covered by strands of thick, coal-black hair. Young, barely crossing the line between girl and woman, she still wore around her neck the deerskin bowstring her mother had woven on the day of her first blood. Today she did not sing. Slender fingers touched the surface of the water, as if she could see something more than a reflection in it. Behind her back, a row of spears lined the ground, a sign of remembrance for those who had fallen in the last skirmish with the Texas buffalo hunters. When she heard the crack of a branch from the grove on the opposite bank, she did not flinch. Her heart beat faster, but her gaze remained calm. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty suede jacket with a faded scarf around his neck. His hair was russet under his Stetson, his face covered with the dust of the road. He took off his hat and stepped slowly toward the water. His name was James Caldwell. He was a farmer's son from Illinois, but had left home as soon as he heard stories of wild lands where you could see the horizon as far as the eye could see. They've met before, several times, in groves where the grass breathed, where footsteps could not be heard. Those meetings had been silent, like the breath of a beast. He did not know her name, but he remembered her eyes, dark as the night sky over the plain. She called him the man without a shout. He never raised his voice, and moved like a hunter. He walked to the very edge of the water, without stepping over the edge. Mahevane looked up. There was something in her eyes that could not be put into words, a mixture of distrust, curiosity, and something unsettling. He spoke first. "I found a big buffalo horn yesterday, a lone one. It was lying in the sun like a sign. I thought, maybe it meant something." She remained silent. Then she nodded faintly. There was more in that nod than in the whole speech. She stood up, slowly, carefully, as if checking to see if he would disappear. Then she turned and walked away without turning around. The tribe had told her that white is like the wind on the rocks. It flows around but does not penetrate the rock. She knew that Chief Old Crow had seen her walking to the river. Her younger brother, Brown Fox, was silent, but his eyes grew heavy. The next day, a group of scouts arrived at the camp. They told us that a new settlement had been built 3 days' journey south. White settlers, with wagons, families, and guns. The Cheyenne realized that cutting down trees, hunting without permission, and disease would follow. In the evening, around the campfire, Old Crow said, "They're coming. We must retreat or die standing." The night was cold. James stood alone at the foot of the hill, looking toward the camp, knowing there was a fire burning where she sat. His expedition was onward, toward the Rocky Mountains, but he could not leave. His companions said it was dangerous to be seen among the Indians. One of them, Davis, told how his uncle had been killed with an arrow for trying to take water from the wrong creek. James wasn't listening. He felt he had stayed, not for exploration, not for gold or maps, but for her. On the third day after their last meeting, he crept into the thicket, knowing that this was the time when she came to the river. But instead, he saw a boy, about 11 years old, thin, with a spear in his hand and a hard look in his eyes. Brown Fox stood still. Then he said, "My father says the white wolf eats meat and watches us die. You are not a white wolf, but you can become one." After saying that, he walked away. James didn't stop him. He realized someone already knew. Someone was watching. And that meant danger. At sundown, he did see her, for the last time that month. At the edge of a rocky ridge where only stiff grass grew, they stood close, but they didn't touch. Silent, but they understood everything. Mahavani said, "The spirits will be angry, and my people." "And you?" he asked. She didn't answer. But it was clear in her gaze. She had already chosen. Not a side, but a feeling. In the distance, drums crackled, the rhythm of the alarm. It meant the scouts had spotted movement, the approach of strangers. Their encounter ended abruptly. He disappeared, vanished into the thicket. She stayed, standing, staring up at the sky. Above her head, the evening star slowly surfaced, bright as bone. The morning after an anxious night of drumming, the camp was tensely quiet. The Cheyenne warriors were dismantling weapons, the women hiding valuables and talismans in leather sacks, preparing to move farther northwest toward the ridges where they could hide from the eyes of outsiders. Chief Old Crow did not give orders loudly. A look, a movement of the hand, was enough to start a commotion. The tribe knew that when the spirits were silent, a storm was coming. Mahavani had been with her mother and aunts all morning, weaving bandages of boiled herbs and preparing ashes to cure her wounds. But with each passing hour, her thoughts became more and more distracted. A man's face came into view, alien, but so real in her memory, as if he were part of a dream in which she was already living. His every look, his every movement was forbidden, but at the same time true. Meanwhile, James Caldwell, along with two companions, cartographer Stanley Moore and an amateur photographer named Benjamin Reed, surveyed the plateau east of the camp. They were unaware of the night signals. To them, it was just another expedition, collecting soil samples, measuring distances, making maps for a future report that James promised to bring back to St. Louis. But James felt inside himself that it was no longer for the report that he was walking these places. More and more often he lagged behind, lingering by the creeks, examining the banks, searching, but he knew that every wrong step could be his last. He was too close to the forbidden. On the third day after the drums heralded the approach of the settlers, the Cheyenne discovered the tracks of a wagon. There were furrows in the ground left by the wheels. The warrior trackers reported a family of 4, 2 men with guns, 2 women. They were moving too close. The council of elders gathered at the sacred circle. Old Crow, Long Stone, White Wife, and one of the young hunters, Brown Fox, were present. He was no longer just a boy. He had witnessed the forbidden meeting between his sister and the stranger. He was silent, but his hands were clenched into fists. Old Raven uttered, "The spirits gave us a sign. We ignored it. Now they demand action. If a white man steps into our lands without blessing, he must leave or disappear." It wasn't a sentence, but almost. Brown Fox did not object. He knew what he was talking about. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridges, Mahavani snuck to the river as usual. She knew that if she did not come, something in her would die. Her heart drove her forward. She didn't know if he would come, but there he was, standing in the shadows, as if part of the trees. She stopped, her breath hitching, but she didn't back down. For the first time, she took a step toward him, not the other way around. And he realized the boundary had been erased. He took her hand. The palm was cool but firm. He said, "If you want me to, I'll leave. But tell me, is that all, or will I see you again?" She answered without words, just ran her fingers over his cheek as if she wanted to make sure he wasn't a ghost. It was a touch that held a lifetime of tenderness, fear, strength, and a realization of inevitability. At that moment, a branch crunched behind the trees. He had time to recoil. Brown Fox stepped out of the shadows, his spear lowered, but his eyes full of rage. He did not shout, he did not threaten. He only said, "You are her curse." Then he walked away into the darkness. After this incident, Mahavani did not sleep the whole night. Her mother, noticing her pallor, sent her to an old herbalist. Her mother noticed her pallor and sent her to an old herbalist who boiled her an infusion of aspen bark and thyme, but it did not help. The anxiety that settled inside her was not from illness. She felt her world crumbling, a step down the wrong path leading to the abyss. She knew that the love she had touched was a challenge not only to people, but to spirits. The next morning, the tribe began packing. Old Crow had ordered them to leave the campsite within 2 days. That meant only one thing. The last 24 hours, and she would never see him again. She had to choose between leaving with the tribe and forgetting, or staying and violating everything she'd been taught since birth. Meanwhile, James was making another decision. He left his companions on the hill and headed back to the river. For the first time in the whole expedition, he did not warn them where he was going. He took no weapons or map with him. He just walked, because he knew that if he didn't see her now, she would be gone. Forever. On the shore, they met for the last time. At dawn, the light was shining through the foliage, drawing pale patterns on her face. She said, "If I stay, I die. If I leave, you disappear. I can't be nothing." He replied, "Be yourself." And then she cried. Silently. Tears flowed down her cheeks, falling to the ground, soaking into the dust of the plain. They parted without a kiss, without promises, just a look, only breathing in unison. Then he disappeared into the groves, and she went to the campfire where the riders were waiting. By evening, the tribe had left camp and disappeared into the vast expanse. And in those places, all that's left is a star. Lonely, in a sky where there are no words. Not more than 3 days after the tribe had left the valley near the Arkansas River, shots rang out over those parts. A small detachment of 16 men, led by a garrison captain from Fort Laramie, had arrived to survey the area and clear out possible camps of hostile elements. Among them was a volunteer, listed as James Caldwell, though none of the soldiers knew why he had returned to the area after his expedition had been completed. He did not answer any questions, only kept watching the horizon line where the Cheyenne caravan had disappeared. Meanwhile, the tribe moved along the winding buffalo trail that led to the highlands southwest of the Black Hills. Mahawani walked to the rear of the caravan, helping the old women and the wounded. In the evenings, she sat apart from the fires, turned away to the slopes where the sky seemed to grow deeper. She withdrew. Her brother, Brown Fox, looked at her with increasing gravity. He did not speak of what he had seen, but his silence was like steel. Old Crow, watching Mahivana, one day called out to the white wife, the keeper of the oral tradition and spiritual songs. He said, "The girl carries a schism within her. If we do not purify her path, the tribe will be shaken." Thus, the purification ceremony was appointed. At night, on the 15th day of the journey, she was to be taken to a separate hill, where a rite of exorcism of the alien spirit would be performed. But neither she nor Brown Fox knew that yet. At Fort Laramie, meanwhile, officers were studying a map of the Caldwell expedition. They saw a mark left on the very hill where Mahivani and James had last seen each other. This aroused suspicion. It was decided to send out a sentinel in the direction of the tracks seen west of the old camp. James, hearing of this, left the fort at night. He took only his horse, knife, and compass. He knew, if the army found the Cheyenne, there would be no negotiation. There would be no chance. By morning, he was walking along the edge of the plateau, hiding in the shadows of the cliffs. He followed his intuition, the terrain, his notes. From the ashes of old campfires and abandoned ropes, he knew where the people had gone. On the 3rd day of his journey, he came across tracks, dislodged grass, hoof prints, blood. This wasn't a slaughterhouse. This was ancestral life. He was getting closer. In the tribe, meanwhile, preparations for the ceremony had begun. Mahevane was taken to a tent that had been stretched in a special way, the walls decorated with symbols of purification. Fox tracks, 3 lines, and a circle marking the path of the spirit. Her mother didn't object. It was considered an honor. But inside, she resisted. She didn't know what exactly was going to be banished. She felt that all that was real in her was connected to someone who was white, but not a stranger. Brown Fox approached her before the ritual began. He said, "You are my sister, but now you are something else. If you don't give it up, you will no longer be a part of us." She replied, "I didn't choose. It was like the wind. It comes and it breathes you. I can't stop breathing." Brown Fox left without a word. When the ritual began, smoke wreathed with herbs rose over the hill. The White Wife sang a song of separation. Mahavana's body was wrapped in a blanket of hide, symbolically exorcising her spirit for a time. But it was at that moment, hiding in the bushes at the foot of the hill, that James finally saw her, far away, at the top. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew from the singing and the fire, it wasn't a celebration. He waited for night. As darkness covered the plain and the fires became sparse, he crept closer. He heard her voice. He heard her whisper a prayer, not in the Cheyenne language, but in a whisper as simple as water. "If you are here, don't leave." He entered the circle, broke the taboo, and she saw him. As the women were leading her away, he stepped between them and prevented them from continuing the ritual. It was a moment of confrontation. They didn't fight, they just stared at each other. The White Wife lowered her hands. She said, "You have brought the storm behind you," and walked away. The tribe learned of all this at dawn. Old Crow stood among the warriors and said, "If the spirit has chosen the way of the stranger, let him go with him, but he must know that now he too is an outcast." Thus were the bonds broken. Mahavani and James went south. Not another word was spoken. They were walking along the Santa Fe River on an old trail. The road ahead was a journey into the unknown. But they were together. There wasn't just land behind them. There was history, and erased footsteps on the ashes of fate. The trails they were following were not marked on the maps of the Army Scouts. They were old hunting passages, known only to chiefs and trackers long gone to the spirit world. Where the evening sun stained the sand with the colors of spilled copper, James and Mahavani came barefoot, tired but unbroken. The horses had died of thirst the day before, and the flask of water was the only one left. James didn't give her the last drop. He just smiled and sipped only half of it, silently handing the rest to her. She didn't say a word, but brought the water to his lips, refusing to take it unless he shared it with her. They walked on. Sometimes her braid would unravel, and then he would gather her hair with his fingers, as if it were the most important thing to do. He didn't ask anything, didn't push. He was just there. Their communication did not need words. Every look, every step, every breath between them became a language that was not taught in any school or passed down in songs. It was the language of the survivors, of the exiled, of those united by common pain and hope. On the fourth day of their journey, they found an old cabin by the creek. It was dilapidated, burnt and lichen-covered, but it had a fireplace that still held the ashes of their former lives. This was where they'd stayed. James made a cot of logs and moss, tied skins around the windows. He was a craftsman again, what he had once been in Georgia before fate had brought him to the Great Plains. He was making her home anew, out of wood and care. At night, when the wind rattled the walls, they sat together by the fire. On these evenings, Mahavani told stories she had heard from the White Wife. About the night crow, who takes souls away if a woman lies to her lover. The cloud spirit, who keeps the way for those who leave unwillingly. Of the bear, who fell in love with a warrior and became a woman for fear of losing him. He listened attentively. He memorized each of her stories as if he wanted to carry them into the next world, so that no one could ever distort them. She felt, for the first time since she had left the tribe, that her voice was not only a prayer, but valuable. That words spoken in the dark do not disappear, but remain in another heart. One night, when the wind had died down and the moon hung over the hill like a pendant over a girl's breast, she said, "If things were different, would you still choose me?" He hesitated for a moment, then he said, "I didn't choose. I just walked. And where the path ended, you stood. I stayed." She stopped talking. Then she lifted her hand and put it to his cheek. He didn't move. She ran her fingers along his cheekbone, as if she were trying to memorize the curve, like a pattern on buffalo skin, and then she pressed her forehead against his. For a long time. They didn't kiss. There was no need. Their breathing was closer than any touch. The next day was their first real day of their new life. She gathered roots, he fished in the creek, wove traps for small game. They made no plans. They didn't need tomorrow. They needed now. It was their escape from time, their time in which no one judged, forbade, or took away. But even in the silence of the hills, the memory would not let go. Sometimes, at the hour when the flames died down and night crept over the walls, Mahevane awoke to a cry, not her own, but one she had once heard when the soldiers came to their people's camp. She cried silently. He did not ask. He simply covered her with a blanket and then put his hand on her breast, not as a man, but as a witness to her pain, letting her know he was near. He would not leave. One day she pulled out of her sack a small pouch tied with a buffalo's vein. He knew it was sacred. She silently placed it in his palm. Inside was a piece of yellow stone and a fragment of dried root. It was her amulet. She gave it to him. "It's yours now, so you're mine now." He didn't understand the rituals, but he understood the main thing. He kissed her forehead for the first time. It was like a promise carved in the wind. But their solitude was not eternal. On the horizon, far to the west, the dust was rising unusually, thick. James tensed. He realized this was not a herd, not bison. These were people. Alone he could get away unnoticed, but with her it was almost impossible. He began to prepare. He didn't tell her how he felt. He just went back to gathering driftwood, reinforcing the roof, checking traps. She looked at him and knew he knew something, but she didn't ask. Because deep in her heart, she already felt that something was coming that would change them forever. The morning was deceptively calm. The dew still clung to the leaves, and the starling outside the cabin sang insistently, as if an unknown force were telling it to drive the anxiety from their hearts. James went out first. He walked around the cabin, checked the footprints, and stopped. There in the sand were prints, not deer, not wolf, human. Lots of them. Too many. The tracks weren't fresh, but enough to know that someone had come this way. Probably watching from afar. They weren't soldiers. Their footprints are heavy, straight, healed. This one walked differently, like a scout. Which means Cheyenne. Maybe of a different kind. Maybe the ones who'd been following their trail since they'd fled. He returned to the hut and said nothing. Mahevane looked at him, the look of a woman who knows when the truth has come but has not yet been named. She did not ask, but silently built a fire, gave him a blanket and a wicker bowl of dried fish. But he did not eat. He watched her hands, the way they moved steadily and smoothly, as if there were still time, as if this day were just another day in their solitary life. But he knew that if the Cheyenne had found them, it meant one thing. Her clan had not disowned her, and if they hadn't, they would come now, either with punishment or blood. There was no in-between in that world. A woman couldn't go to a stranger, especially a white man, without consequences. Even if she loved him, by lunchtime, the silence had become unbearable. Even the birds had fallen silent. Then James, no longer concealed, came out with his rifle. At the top of the hill, he stood gazing into the distance, and he saw riders, 6 of them, 1 with a spear, 2 with bows, the rest with rifles. Their faces were far away, but he knew they were warriors, and they weren't following a trail of prey. They were following them. He went downstairs. Mahevane was already waiting. In her hand was her father's old cape, embroidered with a turtle ornament, the symbol of the family. So she knew too. James wanted to speak, but she was ahead of him. "You won't shoot." He squeezed the buttstock with his fingers. He said nothing. "They've come for me. I'll go. You don't have to die." He exhaled. That air felt heavy, like every part of his body was fighting her. "If you leave, you're not coming back," he said quietly. She moved closer. Not slowly, not goodbye, just as she always did. Standing in front of him, she put her palm to his heart, feeling the beat. "I don't belong to them anymore. But if you start a war, you will die, and then no one will hear our story." He stepped forward. He hugged her as tightly as if he wanted to pull her into him, to hide her from everything. In that moment, he thought not of honor, not of fighting, just of the way her hair smelled like the earth after rain, the way her hand trembled as if it were a current of life that knew it would be torn. But the war had already come. They went down together. On the plain between two old oaks, warriors were already waiting. He recognized the face of one. It was Noctav, the nephew of the former chief, the hunter that had always envied her father. He was in no hurry to get off his horse, but his eyes were throwing lightning bolts. "You have broken the way of the ancestors," he said. "You have given the blood of your kind to an outsider. You are no longer the daughter of a jackal. You are now the daughter of the void." Mahevane stood still. Next to her was James, tall, with a straight back. He didn't understand all the words, but he knew it was a trial. "We didn't come to negotiate," continued the other. "We have come to take her away. You, stranger, if you stay, you will never see another dawn." James clutched his rifle, but before he could say anything, Mahevane stepped forward. Her voice was unexpectedly loud. "I am my father's blood, and if you have come for me, you must hear that I do not belong to you. I left not out of fear, but out of choice. And if you want my blood, take it. But he'll be gone." They glanced around, but no one moved. Then one of the younger ones, with a face almost boyish, pulled a spear out of his bag. It was familiar. It was the spear of her brother, killed in an ambush during a battle with the cavalry a year ago. Mahevane sank to her knees. And then everything changed. James, unable to bear it, stepped forward, put his rifle on the ground, and, looking directly at Noctav, said, "Kill me if that's what you want, but know that her heart is not yours." A second lasted as long as a lifetime. Then the eldest of the warriors, gray-haired, with a face carved like a rock, lowered his gaze. Then he said, "We don't kill those who have accepted their fate. You have. So has she. We cannot bless you, but we can't curse you either." They turned around. Not a word, not a look, just dust. When it settled, James stood in the same position. It was only then that Mahevane ran up and embraced him, not like a woman to a man, but like a soul to a soul. They went back to the cabin. They were silent, but the silence was not fearful. It was like the night after a storm, alive, real. Winter came suddenly, as it does on the Great Plains, not by calendar, but by the breath of the earth. The wind changed its voice, heavier, sharper, as if the air itself had lost its patience. The trees had fallen overnight, and now the world that surrounded their cabin seemed as empty and vulnerable as skin without clothes. The snow came early, not fluffy and light, but coarse, sticky, angry. James split log after log, and his hands could no longer feel his fingers. He didn't complain. He was the kind of man who had learned to keep quiet, especially after the warriors left without taking her. They never spoke of that day again. He kept it inside him, the way a soldier keeps a piece of metal in his body, without pulling it out, lest it bleed. Mahevane sat by the fire more often, weaving dry leaves into amulets, speaking softly, mostly in the language of her ancestors. Sometimes she just sang. These songs had no words, only sounds, long, like the wind in the old mountains, and so sad that the house itself seemed to bend under their weight. But there were nights when she laughed, truly, without fear. They drank sage infusions, gathered bark and grass for the winter, and lived as best they could, not calling it life, but feeling that there would be no other world for them. James had once tried to write down everything that had happened. The pages of his notebook were scribbled, interspersed with precise descriptions, dates, names, places. He wanted someone to know someday. Not everything was as the newspapers in the eastern cities said it was. It wasn't all blood and hate. There was also love, truth, a price. He reread what he had written and burned it all, because he realized that the story told on paper was dead. But the story that lived in their hearts lived on as long as their hearts beat. With the coming of winter came a lonely guest. On the third day of severe frost, at dusk, a rider approached their hut. The horse walked slowly, limping. The man was shrouded, his face almost invisible. James stepped out with his rifle, but did not raise it. Mahevane followed and stopped like a dummy. The guest took off his hood. It was a woman, about 40 years old, wrinkled not from time, but from wind and pain. She spoke in Cheyenne, slowly, firmly. Mahavan listened without interrupting, then came over and hugged her, for a long time, without a sound. When she left, leaving a sack of dried meat and a piece of deerskin, Mahavane said only one thing. "My father's mother. She knows." They never spoke of that meeting again. The snow was getting deeper. Food was getting scarcer. The stove smoked. One night, when the wind was breaking tree limbs with a bone-crunching sound, Mahevane woke to a pain in her chest. James scooped her up, pillowed her up, gave her an infusion of water. Her breathing became shallow. He saw in her eyes, not fear, peace. She took his hand. She put it on her stomach. "If we were birds, we wouldn't know who was whose kind, whose blood. We'd just fly." He squeezed her palm. "You're my star, over this plain, in my sky." She fell asleep. He didn't know for how long, but that night she sang again, through her sleep, and he listened until dawn. When the waters flowed in the spring and the first frogs croaked in the lowlands, James stood by the creek with a sharpened stake. He was building a raft, not to get away, to have a choice, because life is always a choice, and death is no more. Mahevane sat on the knoll, watching him work. On her lap lay an old leather band, an amulet her father had once worn. She tied it around her wrist and then around his. That's how we lived. There was still war in the distance. And in the newspapers they wrote about progress, about land development, about new life. But between the trees, where only the wind and the wolf could be heard, lived their truth, invisible, uncomfortable for history, but real. And when at night, lying beside him, he would ask, "What next?" She would answer, "We're here now."